We're continuing into the third week of our sermon series on the 7 pillars of servant leadership. Now, just a reminder, or if you weren't here last week, the servant leadership is for all of us. We're all called to be servant leaders, not just the pastors, not just the leaders of the church, but each and every one of us. And so each and every one of us needs to work on developing this set of skills that are important on being a faithful person, a faithful follower of God, as well as a servant leader in following God. And so today we're going to talk about the importance of being a skilled communicator. Now, for many of you, you may be like me, and when you hear that phrase to start with, you might think, oh, an orator, a speaker, in front of a group of people. But actually, that's not what we're talking about at all. And sometimes we can get caught up in thinking that's the best way to be a skilled communicator. I remember one time when one of my daughters was, I think, in college, and she came home and wanted to do something in her room and needed my help. And so I went up in the bedroom with her, and as we were helping do the stuff, I stumbled upon just a little shoebox. And in that shoebox, I found 2 eggs and a $100 bill. And I looked at my daughter and I said, Amanda, I said, what is this? And she said, every time throughout the years of growing up, every time I heard you preach a bad sermon, I put an egg in the box. And I thought, wow, I mean, she's almost 20, there's only 2 eggs in that box. And I said, well, where did the $100 bill come from? And she said, well, every time I got a dozen eggs, I sold them. So, you can be humbled if you think that standing in front of people and preaching or communicating or speaking is what it means to be a skilled communicator. For me, I want to say what skilled communication is. It's the foundation, it's the basis for effective leadership. Whether you're a pastor, whether you're a parent, whether it's at work, whether it's just in a committee setting in the life of the church, you have to communicate well to be an effective leader. But notice that the key word to me in here is skilled or skillful communicator. That's what's important, because that means that I'm not only listening to others, but I'm trying to understand them as they're expressing their thoughts and feelings and needs to me. And then after I've heard them, I want to listen with a genuineness. I want to listen to them with respect. I want to then ask for clarity, and so I can learn exactly what they're trying to tell me. And then I want to communicate the same way with others around me. Never forget this. It's so critical and it's so important. Communication skills are truly relational skills. So communicating is not about having a 3-point message. In fact, it's not about making sure I communicate the exact right information to you. Is that even though those things are important, skillful communication is based on my understanding that I'm in relationship with you. And I'm going to continue to develop that relationship. And if I can do that, then I'm going to be a skillful communicator and communicate what I do. And you need to accomplish some certain things to do that. And I'm just going to throw some words out at you here. Don't get too scared. One of those words is you need to have empathy. And I know that's a word that we don't use a lot. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it later and kind of define it for us. But basically it means if I have empathy for you, I not only hear you, but I seek to understand where you're coming from. Your feelings, your thoughts, your needs, your desires, all of those things. I also need to have a warmth. I need to show that I care. I need to have a genuineness. I need to have to take initiative in that, not only in talking, but in listening to you. I need to disclose part of myself when I'm communicating. That's so important, because I think if we're going to be skillful, then you need to know I'm disclosing not just facts, not just figures, not just data to you, but I'm disclosing myself to you. And then, part of it that sometimes we all avoid, we also need to be able to confront in situations if we're going to be a skillful communicator. All of those things are extremely important, but there are 3 core competencies that we need if we're going to be a skillful communicator. Those are on the screen for you right now. First, we need to demonstrate empathy. Second, we need to invite feedback. And third, we need to communicate persuasively. Sometimes we get to that last one and we think that's all we need to do to be a skillful communicator. But the truth is, we need to do each of those, and we need to perfect them in us as much as we can to become the communicator that God calls us to be. And so we're going to jump and we're going to start with those, but I was reminded of a story this week because the importance of this idea of empathy is so important in how we communicate. And I remember a story about a man who moved into a neighborhood, and he was walking around in the neighborhood trying to greet people and learn his neighbors, and there was a neighbor on a porch, and he was sitting there with a dog, and he decides to go up and greet the neighbor. And so he walks up the stairs, and he said, hi, and he introduces himself, and the neighbor introduces himself back. He says to his new neighbor, he said, does your dog bite? And the guy says, no, my dog doesn't bite. And so he reached down to pet the dog, and the dog bit him right on the hand. And the guy said, geez, I don't understand this. I thought you said your dog doesn't bite. He said, I did, but that's not my dog. You see, there wasn't much empathy in that conversation, was there? He really didn't care that the man might get bit. So empathy and demonstrating empathy is the key beginning point for skillful communication. In fact, the Native Americans have a great saying, you should walk a mile in my moccasins. And that's really what it's about. If you want to begin by demonstrating empathy, you need to say, okay, what is really going on in their lives? I use these kind of things a lot with the staff because every once in a while somebody in churches get crabby with staff and with pastors, not in this church, but in churches, they will get crabby with some people. And it's really important then that we not just understand that they're crabby, but we need to walk a mile in their moccasins. What's going on with their lives that all of a sudden had them get grumpy or crabby or mean or nasty? And so we begin with that empathy. And that begins how we communicate is by understanding one another. It's when I become keenly aware of your feelings and your needs associated with whatever you're experiencing at the time. That's what empathy is about. Not just noticing that you're frustrated or you're sad or you're angry, but really getting inside and sharing those feelings with you and experiencing your private world much in the way you're experiencing your private world. And then for me to be sensitive to that. And empathy, it must be more than words. It must be put into practice. The great theologian and priest Henry Nouwen was known for saying that I can only care for someone to the extent that I can make room for them in my life. And isn't that true? So I have to have empathy and make room for you. And so we want to begin to talk about this idea of communication and listening with empathy. And listening with empathy isn't as hard as you think. In fact, we're going to show you the ABCs of listening with empathy. And we're going to look at those right now on the screen. Okay, the first one, and it's going to come right up there for us, is to act interested. That is so critical. Doesn't it sound simple that I ought to be interested in what you're saying? But sometimes we have to be reminded of that. If I'm going to be skilled at what I'm doing, I have to act interested in what you're saying. And sometimes that means stopping all the other things I'm doing. And isn't that hard? I know it's hard. Nobody knows any better than me, but it's so critical. And I often talk about this in premarital counseling. I will tell the couples, I said, if you really, really need to communicate with one another, I want to give you a technique. And here's the technique. When the other one is speaking, really listen. Now that sounds easy, doesn't it? But I have to point that out because here's what normally happens. When you start speaking to me, and you start addressing me with a concern or even a thought, what am I doing? Am I just listening? Is that all I'm doing? Or B, am I beginning to think about what my response is going to be? Shoot, you can't have a good argument if you're not ready to respond, can you? But the problem is, when we're forming our response, I'm not being an empathic listener. I'm not listening in depth to what you're saying. In fact, even when I do regular counseling and people come in to see me, I will say the same things often to them. I will say this. I will say, I want you to tell me everything you need to tell me. And then at the end of that time, there may be some silence. Because I really want to listen to every word you say before I think about my response. because it's so critical to do. And so act interested. Want to be a skillful communicator? Act interested. In the children's sermon in the first service, one of the things I did was I asked the children, oh, wow, tell me about your great Christmas present you got. And so one of them would start to talk, and I would turn around and ask another one. And then I would turn around and ask another one. And they called on really quickly while I was doing this. And you're not paying attention to us. You're interrupting. Yet they understood that I was showing them how not to do it. And so it's so important to act interested. The B is to be encouraging. You see, effective listening, it requires us to overcome our tendencies to analyze what the speaker is saying. That often happens in argument, doesn't it? We often think we know what they're going to say before they say it. And so we begin to analyze, oh, well, I know where you're going. Especially if you've been married a long time, isn't that the truth? I mean, when certain things come up, don't you already think you know where the other person is going? Maybe if you're only very short time, it happens too. But we have to be encouraging. And so instead of doing and analyzing, we keep listening and sometimes offer encouragement for them to say more or to expound on what they're saying so we can understand it at a deeper level. So those are both important. And the third piece, the C of this, is extremely important too. Here's where we need to clarify what's being said. It's something I work on with staff on a continual basis. Because as staff in a retreat in January, we really worked on the importance of communicating with one another and holding each other accountable and even confronting each other when necessary. But to do that, we often first have to clarify. Because we think we heard what they said, but if we don't ask for them, we'll never know, will we? So it's important to say, this is what I heard you say. Is that what you meant to communicate to me? And then often clarification can happen, and we've found some great instances of that already in staff. And I think in your life, if you can do that with one another, do that in your family, do it at work, do it when you're working here for something important at the church, but clarify what someone is saying to you. And once it's clarified, then we can understand it. You might even say something like this. You might stick an X, Y, Z in with the ABCs, and you might say something like, let me see if I have this straight. You are feeling X because of Y, and you want Z. You see, I need to clarify. Okay, first of all, I need to clarify how you're feeling, and because why you think you're feeling it, and then what we need to do to resolve if there's a struggle or if there's a bad feeling there. So those are really, really important things in communicating with empathy. After we've learned to communicate with empathy, the next thing we need to do is we need to learn how to invite feedback. Now that's really an important part of what we're doing. It's something I work very, very hard on. If I'm at a staff meeting or I'm working with a group from the church, and I'll give my opinion, and you all know I don't mind sharing my opinion. But then I will ask, I'll say, but you know, I need your opinion on this. You might have more knowledge than me. You might have more history than me. You might have more insight than me. What can you tell me that's going to help with this situation? So I invite feedback to what I say. Thomas Jefferson once said, our critics are our friends because they show us our faults better than anyone else. And sometimes that's part of a critique. It's like, you're helping me understand maybe something I'm not doing properly. So I want to invite feedback from you. And to do that, it's important to do that, by the way, face to face. Notes are okay for communicating information. They're not good for communicating feelings and having confrontations. And the worst kind of a note is an unsigned note. When I was a youth pastor many, many years ago, I had a senior pastor one time. I received a note, a complaint, believe it or not, hard to believe, but I had a complaint, and I was stewing over it, and I took it to the senior pastor, and he picked it up, and he looked at it, and he threw it in the trash in like 2 seconds. I said, why'd you throw it in the trash? And he said, well, it was unsigned. He said, I don't waste my time reading unsigned notes. But notes are not a good way to communicate. And unsigned notes, and by the way, that is my practice, so I don't get many, but I'll just let you know, if you really want to communicate to me, that's not the best way. And so we need to work on that. And then, as you're inviting feedback, part of inviting feedback is this thing that we need to do, and I want you to understand. You need to be open, you need to be responsive, thoughtful, calm, mean, isn't it important to be accepting when somebody wants to offer you feedback? I mean, don't interrupt them, but once they're done, then clarify like we talked about earlier. Is this what I heard you say? I want to know so we can work on this together. And then once you've got all that done, then it's important to understand what it means to be assertive. Because assertiveness is an important part of being a skillful communicator. Now, by that, I don't mean you're arguing to get your point across. Being assertive simply means, being assertive is a way, a method, for us giving our message, expressing ourselves in communication clearly and thoughtfully. Assertiveness is a way to take charge of our lives, and that's so important that we begin to do that. And there's a certain pattern I like to see happen. When I'm going to be assertive and I've received some feedback, and I'm not going to be aggressive, I'm just going to say, okay, this is my perspective. First thing I do is I decide how I'm feeling. Now that sounds simple, doesn't it? But if you come to me and you said, you know, your leadership on the financial campaign was just terrible. Okay, as we begin to discuss that, I need to decide what I'm feeling. Am I feeling, when you said that to me, am I feeling angry at you? Am I feeling hurt or sad? Or what am I feeling when you say that to me? And then once I decide how I'm feeling, and I can name it, can say what it is, then I claim it. Okay, I'm really feeling that way. Okay, it's okay. I know who I am, I know how I'm feeling, and then I begin to frame the feeling. And by that I mean I don't let it dominate what I'm going to do next. Well, you've just been made, you just made me angry, so I'm going to come right back at you. I'm going to get right back in your face. But that's not what I do. I frame it and put it in perspective. And then, as we get to the end of that period, then I make a request to clarify. I say, okay, this is what I heard, and I want to make sure that we're on the same page so I can hear your feedback clearly. And then after that, then I give my response, my feedback to your feedback. And I do it in a timely manner, so you need to do it in that setting. I need to be supportive of what you said to me, non-judgmental. You need to be very specific about what we're talking about. Not, not branch it out. If like poor Jill over here says something to me, and I don't say to her, well, Jill, you're always that way. You see, I want to be specific. Okay, I want to understand what Jill was upset about, and I want to work on it with her. And so it's important, and then we can come together. So the second piece of being a skilled communication is this inviting feedback, and that leads us to the final piece, which is communicating persuasively. I know that's something that most of us think that's what being a skillful communicator is all about. But the truth is, it's only a part of it. It's an important factor, but it's not all. As a person of faith, as a servant leader, we need to communicate persuasively. You see, the term leadership doesn't necessarily have a generally accepted definition of exactly what it means, but it always involves being able to influence other people. If I'm a skilled communicator, if I'm an effective leader, if I'm a servant leader, then I'm going to be able to talk to you in a way that's going to help persuade you, that's going to allow my influence. You're going to trust what I say. You're going to believe what I say. You're going to want to respond to what I say because I'm a skilled communicator and I'm communicating persuasively. This last piece, communicating persuasively, has three small pieces to it. I just want to share those with you briefly. The first one of those is that if I'm going to communicate persuasively, I need to have an ethos. Don't worry about these fancy words. Worry about what comes after the fancy word. An ethos is an ethical, credible appeal. I need to be credible in what I do. You know who I am. You trust me. So I'm appealing to you at this level. I'm appealing to you at this level, saying to you from here to here that you know that this is important because Jim has told you it's important. Whether it's the youth group, the youth choir, the children's choir, our Faith and Action Sunday, whatever it might be, when Jim says it, I know that it's going to be credible and ethical because that's who he is, and that's how he communicates. The second part of communicating persuasively is to have a pathos to what we say. And you know what a pathos is? Pathos means an emotional appeal. Emotions are important. We're often moved by emotions. Many of Jesus' parables were filled with pathos, weren't they? They were about poor widows and children and women caught in adultery, and we all related and we felt the emotion of the moment. Many of you, I heard more comments about the story, the true story I told last week, about the little 5-year-old girl that I was sitting with on the plane that had to travel between airports by herself because of the divorce of the family. Most of you, and it was an emotional level that you heard that, wasn't it? You heard that at an emotional level, and you wanted to respond to that. And so that's an important part of communicating persuasively, that I can communicate the power of the emotion I'm feeling so you might experience it. And the final piece, the final part of communicating persuasively is the logos. And that is the logic or the plan, the rational part of what we're doing. Well, it makes sense to do it this way. And here's the direction we would go to do it this way. Whether it's a financial appeal for volunteerism, for whatever it might be, when I say those things. So I'm not talking just about me now. I'm just giving these examples of me doing it. But each one of you can communicate in this way. And it's so extremely important that you begin to develop. If you want to be a servant leader, a servant of Jesus, it's so important to understand that these are the ways that you can lead. And one of the great pillars of this is this idea of being a skillful communicator. And one of the best ways of being skillful in communicating is storytelling. You'll notice I often use stories in sermons, not every week, but often do, because sometimes you hear the message better through the story than you do through my logical mapping it out one step at a time. And everybody's different in that. One of the greatest storytellers of all time was Abraham Lincoln. And I remember a story about him. There was a bill that he kind of wanted passed, but he just wanted a decision made. He got to this point where he really wanted a decision made, and back in those days, Congress wasn't very effective. I'm sorry, that was too easy. But anyway, it wasn't very effective. And so there was a whole group that couldn't decide how to vote on an issue. That never happens now. They decide before the issue comes up. But in those days, they couldn't decide. And so he met with a group of congressmen, and he told them a story. And it was a story about a mule, and this mule was located precisely halfway between two spots to eat. Exactly halfway, and the mule couldn't make up its mind on which way to go to eat. And eventually it stayed in the middle until it starved to death. They got the point. They voted on the legislation. And you see, that's where I end up with you today. So when I come to this final point, and I want to take this and motivate you, what do I want to do? I want to motivate you to move. I don't want you to be stuck in the middle. I'm trying to communicate to you the importance of being a servant leader. And the importance, in this case, of learning how to communicate, with skill, so it can make a difference in your life and in people's lives. So I don't want you stuck in the middle deciding, oh, geez, I want to do it now, I want to do this, and I'm stuck. I want you to begin to process this day about what God is calling you to do. What God wants you to do in the life of our congregation. What God wants you to do in your life. And I'm hoping that you can hear God speaking through these messages of the importance of your leadership. Every one of you are called to be a leader in the church of Jesus Christ. And I hope you hear this day that God is calling you to do something, and I hope you can decide which direction to move. Sometimes it's better off to do something than nothing, right? So where is God calling you to move? And as we continue to develop this sermon series on servant leadership, I want you to look each and every week and to say, God, what are you asking me to do now in my situation, and how can I move forward for the kingdom of God? And if we can do that together, what a difference we'll make in the church, in our community, and in our world. Thanks be to God.